reporters are now filing out of the courtroom where, again, Dennis Hastert was sentenced to 15 months in prison. I want to bring in our reporter, Derrick Blakley, who was inside. Can you talk about the emotions that you experienced in the courtroom today?
Well, undoubtedly, the moments of highest emotion were the testimonies on behalf of the two victims. The sister of Jolene Bird, the sister of Stephen Reinbold, very emotional in her testimony, talking about the long-term damage that was done to this young man as a result of the molestation from Dennis Hastert. He was seriously emotionally damaged. Of course, he wound up dying of AIDS, but never could hold a steady job, always just never could just come to grips with his life as a result of this experience in her testimony. And of course, it would seem that nothing could trump that, but then we had the revelation of the identity of individual D, and that, of course, was Scott Cross, the brother of the former House Minority Leader, Representative Tom Cross, who was also in the courtroom along with other members of the family.
His testimony was powerful.
His testimony was extremely powerful. He went into detail about exactly what happened. He was choking back tears through much of that time, talking about the incident of molestation that occurred to him while he was the senior of the Yorkville High School wrestling team, that molestation occurring during a field trip for the team. And he absolutely had many of the people in the courtroom near tears themselves.
After Judge Durkin handed down the sentence, 15 months, what was Hastert's reaction?
Didn't really see almost any visible reaction on his part. Of course, by that time he had already offered his own statements and testimony. He gave apologies for his conduct, but his apologies were somewhat vague. He apologized for his misconduct, a kind of generic apology. But then he was questioned directly by Judge Durkin, asked, "Did you molest Stephen Reinbold?" He said, "Well, I don't quite remember that." But he then later admitted that he did molest Stephen Cross and two other victims as well. So he had to be pinned down to make that revelation in the courtroom because he did not make that revelation voluntarily. The other point that came out, back to Stephen Cross for a moment, and this was absolutely amazing. Dennis Hastert himself apparently called Tom Cross looking for a letter of commendation to the judge, even though he had molested Tom Cross's brother. First, Hastert apparently called himself. Then later, he was followed up by a phone call from his law firm. The judge found that absolutely incredulous, and he really was very strong in his condemnation of that.
All right, Derrick, share a little bit more about what the judge said to Hastert during the sentencing hearing.
Well, it was a very, very long statement. It wasn't brief at all. The judge said essentially that he certainly said that because he was a major public figure, he could not accept any kind of lesser treatment. In fact, more was expected of him. He talked about how he had completely used his position as a wrestling coach to he had abused his position as a wrestling coach and teacher in terms of dealing with these young people and had violated their trust.
He came down very hard on Hastert, very harsh words.
Yeah, well, first of all, he said he was a serial child molester, and there was no doubt about that, and said while he could not sentence him as a child molester because the statute of limitations has run out on that, he could not ignore that behavior either, and that he had the ability to consider his entire background in the sentencing. And that is one of the reasons that his sentence went beyond the recommended guidelines of the prosecution. The prosecution, of course, the U.S. Attorney's Office had recommended a sentence of up to 6 months, and he was actually sentenced to 15 months. One other point, he will be, and you may have mentioned this already, he will be sentenced and will serve his sentence at a level 4 medical facility within the U.S. prison system, and he will not report until a place is available for him in a level 4 medical facility.
And right now we're seeing pictures of the elevator. As we all know, we've been mentioning Dennis Hastert was in a wheelchair when he arrived. He has failing health, several different illnesses, and we think in a short time, because the hearing ended about 10 minutes ago, that he should be coming out of those elevators with his attorney.
And on the point of health, Judge Durkin also said that, yes, he acknowledged that he has some severe health problems. Yes, he acknowledged that he suffered a stroke and that he is in failing health. But he said he committed those crimes as an older person, as an elderly person, and his health does not prevent him from being punished as well. And he said he was convinced that a level 4 medical facility within the Bureau of Prisons could adequately care for his medical needs. One of them is located, as you well know, Susanna, in Rochester, Minnesota, near the Mayo Clinic, but there are several others also that were associated with teaching hospitals. And again, he will not be made to report until the judge is assured and the court is assured there is a place for him at one of those facilities.
Yeah, you brought up the point that he was called by Judge Durkin a serial child abuser, and he will be receiving some sort of sex offender treatment as well during his supervised release.
Indeed, his supervised release, of course, after he serves his sentence, he will be evaluated, he will receive psychological treatment. Sometimes there's some testing involved. The exact contours of that were not laid out. And we thought actually the defense team might object to that in some way, shape, or form. We thought that might be a significant point of contention that would be argued in court. However, the stipulations that Judge Durkin laid out in court were agreed to by the defense, no objections, no argument on that, and really no pushback against that characterization by Judge Durkin.
I think because the testimonies by both Stephen Reinbold's sister as well as individual D, who we now know is Scott Cross, they were so powerful. And even though at an old age of 74, the judge really felt that this treatment facility was needed.
He certainly believed that the characterization as a serial child molester was accurate, and that the law had to acknowledge that and also deal with that, even though that was not what he was being sentenced for. He was sentenced for this money laundering charge, basically, that he had structured these withdrawals over 4 years, $1.7 million in cash in order to pay individual A hush money. He also said that that charge was evident, that charge was clear. And he was also very critical of Dennis Hastert for initiating this entire case by lying to federal agents when he was questioned by the FBI. In fact, he said, had he not lied to the FBI, we may not have been in court right now.
We may not even be here today.
We might not even be here today. And he had several choices. He could have told the truth, obviously. He could have simply said, I'm not going to answer these questions right now about what I'm doing with this money. I'm going to get an attorney. But if he had gotten an attorney at that point, he would have had to reveal to someone, even the attorney, why he was paying the money. He could simply not bring himself to do that. His defense attorney wanted the judge to see that as a sense of mitigation, that he was somehow psychologically damaged. He had walled off this time and this information and could not address it. But the judge basically said, no, that is not mitigation. You knew what you were doing, you did it willfully, and you must pay a price.
Yeah, so much was unraveled during this sentencing hearing, and I thought Judge Durkin, from what I heard from the tweets and when I was also in the courtroom, was very poignant about why he felt that even though this was a banking indictment or a banking charge, that he'd delve deeper into Hastert's past.
Exactly. He said that I cannot ignore your past behavior. I cannot sentence you specifically for child molestation. The statute of limitations of that has run out. But he also pointed out several times that if he were being sentenced for that, and if he had been convicted of that in the state court, he would obviously have been serving many, many more than 15 months in prison. He would have received a much longer sentence. And had that been revealed at that time, had he had been convicted for child abuse, in a state court, he probably would not have had this stellar political career.
Yeah.
He probably would not have been
Speaker of the House.
a Speaker of the House, or even a congressman, or even a state representative. So his career was dependent on hiding this past and hiding this abuse. And that was also something that Judge Durkin pointed out very clearly.
And